Hey guys, what's up? So today we're going to talk about Social Security. I'm going to address some myths about it, share some problems that it has, and propose a solution to those problems. So I'm not a historian. I'm not going to go through the entire history of Social Security and how and why it was developed, but I'll touch on a few things as far as history goes that are relevant to some of the myths I'm discussing. So for anyone that doesn't know, you all pay Social Security taxes out of your paycheck. Anytime you see like FICA tax or payroll tax, that's what you're paying into the Social Security program. Now, theoretically, you're supposed to pay 6.2% of your wages up to a cap. I think the cap's around $118,000. 6.2% of your wages into this program, and your employer is supposed to pay 6.2%. But there have been plenty of studies done on this, and most economists generally agree that the extra 6.2% your employer pays directly affects how much they're willing to pay you for the job. So essentially, that's money you could have had that you don't have. So just to simplify things, we're going to say you pay 12.4%, which I know isn't technically true, but uh, in some respect, it sort of is. And honestly, I think the payroll tax in and of itself is terrible. It's a regressive tax. It's payment up to a maximum. Like I said, I think it's around $118,000. So if I make 50 grand, I pay, like I said, in real terms, 12.4% of that. But if I make 200 grand, I only have to pay the tax on the first 118,000. So the effective rate becomes much lower for me. So first of all, I guess touching on one of the problems is it's a tax system that hurts the poor. How much do you think a poor person wishes they had that extra, 6 or 12%? And after we look at some of the other problems, it's going to be even more apparent. Now, a few myths about the Social Security program. A lot of people think Social Security is a right. You're entitled to it. It's a government mandated insurance program with guaranteed benefits. Well, that's not true. When Social Security was first enacted back in 35, it met a lot of opposition. A lot of people thought it was just a purely socialist program, which back then was more frowned upon than it is apparently today. So instead, they marketed this program as insurance, and it's actually still officially titled Old Age Survivors and Disability Insurance. And the way they marketed it, they used these loaded terms. They said workers paid in contributions and earned guaranteed benefits later in life, but that's just not true, unfortunately. Section 1104 of the original Social Securities Act, and this was never repealed, it's still on the record, explicitly states the right to alter, amend, or repeal any provision of this act is hereby reserved to the Congress, and they have. There was a court case back in 1960, Fleming versus Nestor. The end ruling of the Supreme Court was that workers have no contractual right to their Social Security benefits, and they can have those benefits cut or revoked at any time. So, myth number one, it's not guaranteed. It's not an insurance program. Number two, and I know a lot of people that think this, is that Social Security is a private investment account you're paying into, kind of like an IRA, but it's managed by the government. Not only is it not a private account, but it isn't an account at all, and I'll go into detail about that soon, but the concept that you pay in contributions that are set aside for you was again settled in a Supreme Court case, 1937, right after it was passed. Helvering versus Davis. The Supreme Court ruled that, quote, the proceeds of both the employee and employer taxes are to be paid into the Treasury like any other internal revenue generally, and are not earmarked in any way. There is no set aside funds for you. Next myth. So there's no private account, right? But I've heard talk about a Social Security trust. That must mean that all of the money is held in a trust fund by the government. So first we have to define what a trust fund is. There are three parties involved in a trust fund. There's a grantor, who's the person that puts in the money, deposits the investments, the property, the cash. The trustee, who is contractually obligated to maintain those funds. They have legal ownership of them, they manage the investment, and they have a fiduciary responsibility to uphold the terms of the trust agreement. Then there's the beneficiary, who really theoretically could be the same person as the grantor, but normally it's, a family member. Your grandparents set up a trust for you, so you end up being the beneficiary, who you're the person who has access to the benefits of that trust laid out in the trust agreement. So the trustee manages this money for you. So that's what a trust fund is. And to really get into the myth of the Social Security trust, we do have to look at a little bit of history. Like I said, I'm not going to go over everything, but a little bit. In 1935, when the original Social Security Act was passed, there was an account created at the Treasury called the Old Age Reserve Account. And every year, an amount of money was given to the account equal to the amount of money they had to pay out in benefits. Any excess contributions were invested in government debt, i.e. Treasury bonds. So, if more taxes came in than they had to pay out, the government just spent that money. They didn't put it aside or anything, they just spent it and quote, invested it in Treasury bonds. So, if you think about how absurd this is for a second, you're forced to pay taxes to cover Social Security benefits. The government takes your money, pays out contributions, spends the rest, if there is any left over, even though it knows it'll have to pay out more money in the future. So it writes itself an IOU. The government's just like, hey, we're spending this money on another program, but don't worry, we owe ourselves money. They're writing themselves an IOU. But don't worry, because the IOU is going to collect interest. We set this, we're spending the money, but we set it at the interest rate for Treasury bonds. You're going to make money on it. And then you ask, how is it going to make money? Because, government makes money through taxes. So, the government collects more money from you in taxes, and then uses some of that to pay the interest on the borrowed money from you. So essentially you're funding your own interest, or I guess the next generation after you is funding your interest, and you're funding the interest for the current retirees. And this was a criticism given at the time. There was a General Hugh S. Johnson, who was the former head of the National Recovery Administration, pointed out that the government was only issuing claims on itself, hence the Social Security Reserve was merely worthless IOUs. To pay future benefits, Americans would have to be taxed all over again. Responses were given by people supporting Social Security, saying that the Treasury was acting like a bank, investing the money rather than holding cash. But that's not true. The money wasn't being invested. It was being spent on discretionary programs. The only investment the government was doing was forcing you to buy bonds and paying you interest with your own money, which, when you think about it, that's really all bonds are. It's deferred taxation, which is fine if you choose to do so, but the fact that it's being imposed upon you, it's a little ridiculous. Like I said earlier, I'm sure the poor people would prefer to have that money up front rather than have their taxes deferred to when they're 70 years old. So, anyways, in 1939, so a few years afterwards, this criticism was still going on and gaining support. So Roosevelt amended the Social Security Act and created the Old Age and Survivors Insurance Trust Fund at the Treasury. So that's where the myth of the trust fund comes from, but nothing substantial actually changed. They just named it a trust fund to end the controversy. People hear the term trust fund like, oh yeah, that's a safe investment, right? Trust funds are always safe. The only thing that actually changed was that instead of the Treasury directly transferring money from their general account to Social Security payouts, they account for the amount of Social Security contributions and then credit the trust with an equal amount of bonds. So it's if you don't understand accounting, it's sort of like accrued money. It's like accounts receivable, accounts payable. It's money that they say is there that really they have somewhere else. So they credit this trust fund with enough to pay out contributions. Like I'm explaining this very terribly. They take in Social Security contributions and they credit the trust with an equal amount of money in bonds. Then they pay off a portion of those bonds essentially when they send out Social Security checks. So they have credit, pay out contributions, which is equal to paying down the credit in this trust. So whatever's left over in the trust is an IOU for money paid in that the government spent somewhere else. It's essentially just a taxation system loosely attached to a welfare system. There are no named beneficiaries, there is no separately managed account for the taxpayers, no enforceable property rights, nothing that legally establishes a trust agreement. It's just a name. So, let's talk about some problems the Social Security system has. We're getting to the point, thankfully, where medical technology is amazing and people are living longer, which means they're taking benefits for a greater amount of time. Less people are working, in small part because, I guess, of extensive unemployment over the past however many years, but mainly just because less people are being born, The whole baby boomers thing, they had tons of kids, and then now there's a smaller next generation, so we have a smaller workforce paying for a growing retiree group. We're already running deficits. We're already paying out more than we're taking in, but we still have the trust to tap into. But eventually that's going to run out, so there are a few things that can be done to make that not be a serious issue. Taxes can increase, benefits can be cut, the age requirement for payouts can change. They've already done all of these things and probably will do some sort of combination of them again. At the current rate, and this is from the Social Security Administration, we're going to be insolvent by 2033. I think the projections are we'll only have enough to pay 75% of promised benefits by 2033 unless taxes are increased or benefits are cut. Another issue is just it's almost shameful the return you get on Social Security. A lot of people think it's an investment account, and so they're like, "Oh yeah, I paid in this much money, I'm going to get a lot more than that back later." But really, if you do the math, the average return, the annualized return, is around 1%. So if we assume you start full-time employment out of college, 22 years old, paying the estimated $216,000 and change over the lifetime of your career until you retire, which these are just general estimates based on average statistics people paying in, you'd receive about $300,000 in benefits given by the estimated retirement age life expectancy, $300,000 total in benefits from Social Security. That's terrible. That's, like I said, that's around 1%. I think it's like 1.2%. On the other hand, if you were allowed to manage your own money, the stock market as a whole typically averages about 6% a year, annualized out. So, some years are better, some years are worse, averages out to 6% a year. So if you were allowed to take that $216,000, throw it in a broad market index fund, so you don't have to do any research, nothing, you just throw the money at the market as a whole, invest in the entire Dow Jones or the entire NASDAQ index. At an average of 6% a year, you'd end up with just about $950,000 in retirement. 3 times as much money. And yeah, sure, stocks can potentially be risky, you might get less than that, but considering we already went over the fact that Social Security is headed for bankruptcy, and that Congress has explicit authority to revoke benefits at any time, I would take that risk. What can be done about this? Well, there's a few proposed solutions. Ideally, in my opinion, you phase out Social Security entirely. It's an insane program. It's been marketed as something it's not. Everyone's been lied to. It's forced retirement funding, which I'm against forced anything. I believe in voluntary association. George Reisman has a really great article on Mises.org, giving a plan for slowly phasing out Social Security, and if that were to happen, retirement would rest entirely on the individual. Personal responsibility would actually matter again. It doesn't matter at all in this country anymore. Milton Friedman had a great idea years ago. I think he talked about this in '99, of just giving everyone who's already paid into the system a government bond with the present value of what you've already paid into it. So, adjusting for inflation and everything. You've paid in X amount of dollars, here's a bond with that value. Once it gets, once the limit is up on the bond, you'll have that money back. It's fine. Or if you're already retired, to give a bond for the value of the payments you're entitled to. and then after everyone gets the bond, close the system up. No one else pays into it. There'd be no transition costs. Unfunded liabilities become funded, and it might be a pain in the ass for the government in the short term fiscally, but it's a much better idea than the massive fiscal gap we have between current contributions and future promised payments. I talked about that in my other recording about the debt. This massive unfunded liability with Social Security. But of course, the government wants to mandate things, because if they can't mandate things, there's no reason for them to be here. So if we have to mandate a retirement program, I would look to Australia and want to replicate what they do. They have more than just this as Social Security programs, but the main program I'm interested in is a program called superannuation, which gives a mandatory 9% into a private retirement account for the individual. So instead of taking the 6.2 or 12% and just throwing it at the government saying, here you go, it goes into a managed account for you, invested in, I think there's a few different options, but it's a broad portfolio, diversified. This guarantees retirement funds for the individual, maintains some semblance of personal accountability because the more they earn, the more they receive, and they aren't being paid for by another person. Now, you can put more than 9% in, but it's a mandatory of at least 9%, so there's something guaranteed for you. Could the United States transition to something like this? I think so. I mean, first Congress would have to come out and admit that Social Security is not an insurance program, your money isn't being invested, there's no guaranteed benefits, and they'd need to come out and say this has to happen, or no one will get benefits in the future. We've already forecasted, like I said, Social Security will, in the next 30 years, not have enough money if nothing changes. So take the 12.4% mandatory Social Security contributions, slowly phase them out, and implement this superannuation program. Year over year, say, over 25, 30-year period, cut 0.5% of contributions, 0.5% of payouts, put that 0.5% into the superannuation program. It would be damn near painless for everyone involved. I know there'd be some people in the AARP, oh no, you're cutting my benefits by 0.5%. Yeah, that sucks, but it has to happen. Something needs to happen. Because this is an insolvent system. It's destined to fall apart, or it's destined to... You'd have to have massive tax increases, or massive cuts eventually anyways. But something like this would require the government to admit that they were wrong in the first place, so I seriously doubt it will ever happen. Anyways, guys, thanks for listening to this. I'll have, I think either later tonight or sometime tomorrow, Gage and I will do a recording. We're going to talk about the most recent Democratic debate, and I think the next video I'm going to put up related to economics is either going to be something explaining the petrodollar system or something clarifying what inflation actually is, because it's a lot more complicated than people think. Anyways, thanks for listening. I appreciate it, and I'll talk to you guys later.